Chapter 5: The Ceremony. Free of charge. Free stuff is the most expensive. Jomingrui silently mutters, intends to wait no matter what additional services are firmly refused. Tell me I'm traveling if you can. Thinking of this, Jomingrui followed the woman, whose face was painted in red butter, and stooped into the low tent. It was very dark inside the tent, and only a little light seeped in, dimly revealing a table full of cards. Unperturbed, the woman in the pointy hat floated around the table in her long black dress like water, sat across the table, and lit a candle. Dim yellow swaying, the tent seemed to be bright and dark, the instant more mysterious feeling. Jomingrui calmly sat down and looked over the tarot cards on the table, and found that he was familiar with the main cards such as Magician, Emperor, Inverted Hanging Person, and Moderation. Is Comrade Russell really a senior? I wonder if it's a fellow countryman from my big foodie empire. Jomingrui mouth slightly moved, a trance. Before he could finish reading the open cards on the table, the woman known as Divination, his very spirit, had reached out and gathered all the tarot together, folded it into a pile, and pushed it in front of him. You shuffle and cut the cards, whispered the circus soothsayer. Shall I wash it? Jomingrui subconsciously asked back. The soothsayer's face squirmed with red-yellow oil and smiled faintly. Of course. Everyone's fate can only be divinated by himself, and I am only an interpreter. Jomingrui immediately vigilant rhetorical question. No extra charge for interpretation? As a keyboard folklorist, I've seen a lot of similar tricks. The soothsayer obviously froze for a moment, and then said stuffy, it's free. Jomingrui, relieved, put a little more revolver into his pocket, and then calmly extended his hands, skillfully shuffling and cutting cards. All right. He placed the shuffled tarot cards in the center of the table. The soothsayer clasped his hands, looked at the cards carefully for a moment, and suddenly said, Sorry, I forgot to ask, what do you want to divinate? When chasing his first love, Jomingrui also studied tarot cards and did not hesitate to say, past, present, and future. This is a form of divination in tarot cards, in which 3 cards are arranged in order to represent the past, present, and future. The soothsayer first nodded, then turned up his mouth and smiled. Then please shuffle the cards again. Know what you want to ask. And then shuffle the cards that really have symbolic meaning. You just fucked with me. Don't be so stingy. Isn't it that I always emphasize free? The muscles in Jomingrui's face twitched, took a deep breath, took back the tarot, reshuffled, and cut the cards. Is that all right this time? He placed the cut cards on the table. No more. The soothsayer stretched out his fingers, picked up a card from the top, and placed it on Jomingrui's left hand, his voice becoming more and more hoarse. This symbol of the past. This one symbolizes the present. The soothsayer placed the second card directly in front of Jomingrui. She picked up the third card and placed it on Jomingrui's right hand. The sun symbolizes the future. Okay, which card do you want to see first? After all this, the soothsayer raised his head and looked deeply at Jomingrui with his gray-blue eyes. Let's look at now first. Jomingrui thought briefly. The soothsayer nodded slowly and turned over the card in front of him. The card depicts a young man wearing gorgeous clothes and a gorgeous headdress, carrying a cane on his shoulder, luggage hanging from the top of the stick, and a dog pulling at him behind him. The number is 0. The Fool. Soothsayer quietly read out the card, gray-blue eyes fixed looking at Jomingrui. A fool. Tarot's number 0. We can start. Includes all possible starts? Jomingrui is not even a beginner tarot enthusiast, only according to the impression. Self first made a shallow interpretation. Just when the soothsayer was about to open his mouth, the cloth door of the tent was suddenly opened, and the strong sunlight came in. Jomingrui, who was facing away from there, instinctively squinted his eyes. You're pretending to be me again. It's my job to divinate people. A female voice growled angrily. Go back. Remember, you're just a trainer. An animal trainer. Jominguri adjusted to the light and saw in the doorway a woman. In the same pointed hat, black dress, and red butter paint, only taller and thinner. The woman sitting in front of him got up quickly and said, disconsolately, never mind, I just like it. I have to say, sometimes, my divination and interpretation are quite accurate, really. As she spoke, she lifted her skirt, rounded the table sideways, and walked quickly away from the tent. Sir, would you like me to read it for you? The real soothsayer looked at Jominguri and asked with a smile. Jominguri moved the corners of his mouth and asked earnestly, is it free? Not yet, answered the real soothsayer. Never mind. Jominguri put his palm back in his pocket, held down the revolver and the paper money, and bent through the tent. Oh, this is crazy. You got an animal trainer to do your tarot reading. A trainer who doesn't want to be a soothsayer isn't a good clown. Joe Mincewe quickly put the incident behind him and bought a pound of less good lamb at the lettuce and meat market for 7 pence, plus young peas, cabbage, onions, potatoes, and other items, plus the bread before that, for a total of 25 copper pence, or 2 souls for 1 penny. I can't help spending money, poor Benson. Jominguri not only lost the 2 banknotes he took out, but also caught a penny in his trouser pocket. He casually sighed, no longer think much, hurried back home. With the staple food, we're ready for the transfer ceremony. Wait until the tenants on the 2nd floor have left. Jominguri did not rush to carry out the ceremony, but first translated Fusheng Juan Huang Xianzun and other words into ancient Fausiquan and Rune Wen, intending that if the original spell failed to work, then the next day in the local language to try again. After all, we have to consider the difference between the 2 worlds and do as the Romans do. As for the translation into ancient prayer, sacrificial special Hermes, Jominguri, because of lack of vocabulary, difficult to complete. After all this, he pulled 4 loaves of rye bread out of the paper bag, 1 in the corner where the coal stove had been, 1 on the inside of the underside of the mirror, 1 on the top of the cupboard where 2 walls met, and 1 on the right side of the desk where the piles were stacked. Taking a deep breath, Jominguri came to the center of the room, calmed down for a few minutes, and then stepped solemnly, walking the square counterclockwise. Taking the first step, he whispered, Fusheng Xuan Huanyan's Buddha. In the second step, he said in earnest, Fusheng Juan Huang Qianzhen. The third step, Jominguri held his breath and whispered, Blessed Nesmagus, the dark yellow god. In the fourth step, he exhaled his breath and said with Hishart, Happiness is born in heaven. After returning to his place, Jominguri closed his eyes and waited for the results in place, with expectations, unease, hope, and fear in his heart. Can we go back? Will it work? Will there be any surprises? The darkness in front of him was stained with a deep red brought by the light, and the thoughts in Jominguri's mind were surging and difficult to calm down. At that moment, he suddenly felt as if the air around him had stopped moving and became thick and strange. Then came whispers in his ears, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp, sometimes illusory, sometimes seductive, sometimes frantic, sometimes insane. Clearly cannot understand what this mumbling is saying. Jominguri still cannot help but listen to distinguish. His head ached again, as if he had stuck a steel stick into it. Jominguri only feel that the head is about to burst. Thoughts are stained with psychedelic color. He knew something was wrong and tried to open his eyes, but he could not accomplish this simple act. The whole person is increasingly tense, may break at any time. Jominguri inexplicably emerged with a self-deprecating idea. If you don't die, you don't die. He could bear it no longer, And when the string in his head was about to break, the numerous noisy, overlapping murmurs subsided, and the atmosphere became very quiet and ethereal. Not only the atmosphere, Zhou Mingrui felt that his body was also wandering. He tried to open his eyes again, this time with ease. The haze of mist was reflected in his eyes, hazy, fuzzy, boundless. What's going on here? Zhou Mingrui looked startled, then lowered his head and found himself floating on the edge of a vast gray fog. Mist flowing like water, dotted with crimson stars, some of them big, some small, some hidden in the depths, some floating on the surface. Looking at the hologram-like scene, Zhou Mingrui, half confused and half exploratory, stretched out his right hand, trying to touch a deep red star floating on the surface on his right side, looking for a way to leave. Just as he touched the surface of the star with his fingers, a streak of water suddenly gushed out of him, causing a crimson explosion like a dreamy firework. Zhou Mingrui was startled. The right hand panicked back, accidentally encountered another crimson. So, this star also followed the bright. As a result, Zhou Mingrui felt that his head was empty and his spirit was lax. Inside a luxurious villa in Bakeland, Queens, the capital of the Kingdom of Ruin, Audrey Hall sat at her dressing table and rubbed the antique, cracked copper mirror on it. Mirror, mirror, wake up! In the name of House Hall, I command you to wake up. She changed one explanation after another, but the mirror did not respond. After 10 minutes, she finally chose to give up. Grievances zipped her lips and whispered, "My father is really deceiving me. Every time he tells me that this mirror is the treasure of the Black Emperor of the ancient Solomon Empire, is an extraordinary object." Before she had finished speaking, the bronze mirror on the tabletop suddenly burst into a crimson glow and enveloped her. Off the coast of Sunia, a three-masted ship, apparently out of date, is sailing through a storm. Alger Wilson stood on the deck, his body heaving with the bumps, keeping his balance easily. He wore a robe embroidered with lightning bolts and held in his hand an oddly shaped glass bottle, which sometimes billowed with bubbles, sometimes frozen into snow, and sometimes blew out by the wind. "All we need is ghost shark blood," whispered Alger. At that moment, there was a crimson burst between the glass bottle and his palm, and for a moment it flooded the surrounding area. In a gray mist, Audrey Hall regained his sight and looked around in horror and confusion. He saw a man with a blurred head and shadowy figure on the opposite side. Then, almost at the same time, they noticed that not far away stood a mysterious man covered with gray mist. Mystery Man Zhou Mingrui is equally dumbfounded. "Where is this, sir? What do you want to do?" Audrey and Alger stared into silence, then spoke in unison.